The Messerschmitt Bf 109 wasn't just Germany's most iconic World War II fighter, it was the most produced fighter aircraft in history. Over 33,000 were built, and it turned young Luftwaffe pilots into living legends, or martyrs. It helped shape the terrifying dominance of the German Air Force and led to some of the highest kill counts ever recorded by a single pilot. But while its sleek design and raw power made it a symbol of Nazi air superiority, it hid a deadly flaw, one that didn't just hurt Germany's enemies. It killed its own men before they ever fired a shot. Thousands of German pilots died not from enemy fire, but from something baked into the design of the aircraft itself. This is the hidden story of the Bf 109 and the dark truth behind the deaths of over 1,700 of its own. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles made one thing painfully clear. Germany was not to have an air force, period. No combat aircraft, no training programs, not even the blueprint for a fighter plane. The world believed it had clipped Germany's wings for good. But what the Allies didn't understand was that the silence was just a disguise. Beneath the surface, behind locked factory doors, and under the label of civil aviation, Germany was preparing for the next war long before anyone else saw it coming. By the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler had risen to power, and the masks began to come off. Germany's aviation industry was quietly advancing in plain sight. And at the center of this rapid transformation was an ambitious Bavarian designer, Willy Messerschmitt. His creation would become one of the deadliest symbols of Nazi air power, the Bf 109. Fast, sleek, and radically advanced for its time, the Bf 109 didn't just represent Germany's technological leap, it became the very face of the Luftwaffe. The world's first glimpse came in 1936, during the Berlin Olympics. Amidst the orchestrated pageantry and propaganda, Germany unveiled the Bf 109 prototype in the most chilling way possible. It shattered the international speed record. Even more disturbing? That record was set using a British-built Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. The message was loud. Germany wasn't just back, it was ahead. And worse, they were using foreign technology to do it. But this was only the beginning. The Luftwaffe had plans for this new weapon, and they were ready to unleash it. By 1937, the Bf 109 wasn't just a prototype. It was the most advanced single-seat fighter in the world. All-metal construction, a closed cockpit, retractable landing gear, everything about it screamed speed and power. While other countries were still flying wood and canvas biplanes, Germany had just reinvented aerial warfare. It was tested in Spain during the brutal Spanish Civil War, where it tore through outdated Soviet planes and earned its stripes against early monoplane rivals. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was the backbone of a future war machine. By the time Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Bf 109 led the charge, dominating the skies with ruthless precision. It was Germany's blade, and it was cutting through Europe without resistance. Armed initially with two synchronized machine guns firing through the propeller arc, the aircraft was deadly even in its early form. But when German intelligence discovered that the British Spitfire was entering service with 8 wing-mounted guns, the arms race escalated. The Bf 109 evolved. Two 20mm cannons were added to the wings, capable of firing high-explosive shells that detonated on impact. These weren't just bullets. These were sky-borne grenades. The plane continued to morph with each mission and each battlefront. It was fitted with more powerful Daimler-Benz engines, better weapon systems, and even a cannon that fired through the hollow propeller shaft, a marvel of engineering. But this constant evolution hid a deadly secret, one that wouldn't become clear until thousands of pilots had already paid the price. Despite all its innovation, all its firepower, and all its deadly precision, the Bf 109 had a flaw so dangerous it would kill over 1,700 of Germany's own pilots, and not in combat. The problem wasn't in the air, it was on the ground. You see, in the quest for speed and aerodynamic performance, Messerschmitt had made a crucial sacrifice. Instead of mounting the landing gear on the wings, like many fighters of the era, the Bf 109's undercarriage was fixed directly to the narrow fuselage. The result was a clean, sleek profile in flight, and a death trap during takeoff and landing. The narrow wheelbase made the plane highly unstable on the runway. Any small mistake, a crosswind, a bump on the ground, was enough to flip the aircraft or send it careening into disaster. Even experienced pilots struggled with it. For rookies, the Bf 109 was almost like a coin toss. Would it take off clean? Or would it slam nose first into the dirt? That gamble cost Germany dearly. During training alone, over 10% of all Bf 109s were destroyed in non-combat accidents. The Luftwaffe lost more than 1,750 pilots to crashes that had nothing to do with enemy fire. These weren't battlefield casualties. They were mechanical failures, structural flaws, and fatal design choices that never got fixed. Even as the war raged on and the aircraft evolved, that flaw remained. The Bf 109's legacy would be tied not just to its battlefield prowess, but to the silent, brutal toll it took on its own men before they ever had a chance to face the enemy. By the summer of 1940, the Bf 109 wasn't just feared. It was feared for a reason. It had helped the Luftwaffe blitz through Poland, overrun France, and humiliate Allied air forces across Europe. But now, it was about to face its greatest challenge yet: the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain was not just a campaign, it was a test of endurance, range, and tactics. And here's where the Bf 109's strength became its weakness. Designed as a short-range interceptor, the 109 wasn't built for long-distance escort missions. Yet that's exactly what it was tasked with: flying cover for German bombers from bases in France, across the English Channel to Britain, and back. On paper, the plan looked daring. In the sky, it was a death sentence. Once the Bf 109s crossed into British airspace, they had just 15 minutes of combat time before needing to turn around. There was no margin for error. If a dogfight dragged on too long, or if pilots lost their bearings, they wouldn't make it back. And many didn't. One Luftwaffe veteran recalled, "The clock was always ticking. Every bullet we fired was a gamble. Stay too long, and the channel becomes your grave." The problem was compounded by speed. German bombers flew significantly slower than the 109s, forcing the fighters to reduce speed and stay in tight formation. It was like telling a lion to babysit a turtle in a war zone. Spitfires and Hurricanes exploited this limitation relentlessly. Time and again, the 109s would be forced to break off, leaving bombers exposed and vulnerable. Many German pilots died not in glorious battle, but simply because they ran out of fuel on the way home. By the end of the Battle of Britain, over 600 Bf 109s had been destroyed, and the Luftwaffe had lost its aura of invincibility. For the first time, the limits of the 109 were exposed, and the myth of German air dominance had cracked. After the devastating losses over Britain, Germany turned its gaze to North Africa. The campaign would stretch the Bf 109 to its environmental limits. The desert wasn't just hot, it was unforgiving. Sand got into everything. Engines choked, filters clogged, hydraulics failed, and the 109th, designed for the skies over Europe, wasn't built for the Sahara. To survive, it had to adapt. fast. Enter the tropical variant, a modified version of the Bf-109 fitted with air filters, drop tanks, and desert camouflage. On paper, the upgrades were enough to keep the fighter flying. But in practice, the aircraft struggled. Visibility during landing was poor, and in the heat, the narrow undercarriage issue became even more deadly. Rough desert airstrips and sudden crosswinds turned landings into roulette spins. More than a few pilots didn't survive them. Combat in North Africa also introduced the 109 to a new adversary, the British Supermarine Spitfire Mark V. In the skies over El Alamein, these newer Spitfires matched the Bf-109 in power and agility. What had once been a near unbeatable aircraft was now forced into desperate measures, often stripped of armor or fitted with experimental weapons that hurt more than helped. And yet, despite all this, the Bf-109 endured. It kept evolving, shedding old designs and embracing new ones. Aces were made in the desert, but every kill came with a cost. As the Luftwaffe lost experienced pilots, younger and less trained recruits stepped into the cockpit. The margin for error, already thin, vanished entirely. Veteran pilot Hans Joachim Marseille once said, "The 109 is a sword, but hand it to the untrained, and it cuts both ways." In North Africa, the Bf-109 proved it could adapt, but not without bleeding. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of warfare. Over 3 million German troops poured into the Soviet Union. Leading the assault from the sky was the Bf-109, now updated to the F variant. Faster, lighter, more precise. It had dropped its wing-mounted cannons in favor of concentrating all firepower in the nose, 2 synchronized MG-17s above the engine, and a 20mm motor cannon through the propeller shaft. In Soviet skies, this layout turned the 109 into a sniper. Against outdated Soviet aircraft like the Polikarpov Tu-16 and the Yak-1, the Bf-109 tore through the Red Air Force. And with that dominance came names that would echo through history. Erich Hartmann, the Blonde Knight, would go on to claim 352 aerial victories, more than any pilot in history. Behind him, Gerhard Barkhorn, with 301 kills. These weren't just pilots, they were living legends, or so it seemed. But there was a sinister truth behind those numbers. Unlike Allied pilots, who rotated home after a certain number of missions, Luftwaffe pilots stayed on the front lines indefinitely. No rest, no leave, no relief. If you survived, you flew again, and again, and again, until you didn't. That policy created monsters in the sky, men who flew hundreds of missions, racked up hundreds of kills, but burned out completely. Many of them didn't survive the war. Some cracked from the pressure, others simply vanished into the cold Russian winter. As Germany pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the 109 became both weapon and coffin. And through it all, the design flaw, the narrow undercarriage, still claimed lives. Even after a brutal dogfight, pilots had to fight the landing. Imagine surviving 800 missions only to die on touchdown. That was the reality. In the vast, endless skies of the Eastern Front, the Bf-109 was both king and killer, of the enemy and its own. As World War II dragged into its deadliest years, the Bf-109 wasn't just holding the line, it was being pushed beyond its original design philosophy. The G variant, known as the Gustav, became the most widely produced model of the aircraft. More than 23,000 were built, and while it was a marvel of German engineering, it came at a brutal cost to the men who flew it. The Gustav featured a more powerful Daimler-Benz D B605 engine, giving it better climb rates and higher top speeds. Its firepower was also upgraded. Two 13mm MG-131 machine guns mounted above the engine replaced the older MG-17s, providing far more stopping power. It retained the motor cannon through the propeller hub, which in some variants was upgraded to a 30mm Mk-108, an absolute monster capable of shredding Allied bombers in a single hit. But with great power came devastating compromise. The new weapons, added armor, and extra fuel tanks made the Gustav heavier, significantly heavier. Its wings and fuselage weren't redesigned for the added weight. As a result, the plane's agility suffered. Maneuvering in dogfights became harder, and acceleration worsened. The very upgrades that made it deadly also made it vulnerable. To increase versatility, some Gustavs were outfitted with underwing gun pods, each housing an additional 20mm cannon. But these gondole attachments added even more drag and weight. Aces hated them. The added firepower wasn't worth the sacrifice in performance. "You could kill a bomber," one pilot later recalled, "but you'd be dead meat if a Mustang showed up." The final insult came in the form of rocket launchers, unguided WGR-21 mortars designed to disrupt bomber formations. But these were wildly inaccurate and turned the 109 into a sluggish, floating target. Germany was becoming desperate. The Luftwaffe needed miracle weapons, and they were turning the Bf-109 into a Frankenstein of modifications. Despite this, the Gustav still racked up kills, held the skies, and defended the Reich. But each mission demanded more from the pilots, who were now flying heavier, slower, and increasingly unstable aircraft, with enemies more skilled and aggressive than ever before. By 1944, the situation was catastrophic. The Allied bombing campaign was hammering German industry into the ground. Ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, and aircraft factories were obliterated day after day. Fuel was scarce. Replacement parts were delayed. And worst of all, the pilots were gone. Most of the experienced Luftwaffe aces were dead, missing, or too burned out to continue. The average pilot lifespan on the Western Front had shrunk to just a few weeks. Young trainees, barely out of flight school, were being shoved into cockpits and thrown into the skies against waves of P-51 Mustangs, Spitfire Mark 9s, and P-47 Thunderbolts. They didn't stand a chance. Training had been cut drastically. In the early war years, pilots logged 200-plus hours before combat. By 1944, it was often less than 50. Some rookies had never even fired their weapons in practice before facing live enemy formations. The Bf-109, already known for its tricky takeoffs and lethal landings, was completely unforgiving. These young men were essentially flying coffins, and the flaws didn't go away. The narrow landing gear still caused fatal accidents. The lack of rearward visibility meant rookie pilots were often picked off before they even realized they were under attack. One veteran called it a blindfolded sprint into a minefield. Meanwhile, the Gustav's heavier airframe meant those fatal ground loop crashes became even more common. Luftwaffe instructors admitted that they lost more aircraft in training crashes than in combat during some weeks in 1944. The Bf-109, once a symbol of dominance, had become a symbol of attrition. Germany's Air Force wasn't losing because of inferior machines. It was losing because its machines demanded perfection from men who barely had time to learn how to fly. By the time the Allies crossed into France after D-Day, most surviving 109s were grounded due to lack of fuel or experienced mechanics. The Luftwaffe was no longer a force. It was a graveyard of ghosts and glory. As Berlin crumbled and the Reich collapsed, the Bf 109 still flew. With flames consuming the fatherland and Soviet tanks rolling into Germany, Luftwaffe pilots took to the skies in desperation. Some flew solo suicide missions, others scrambled to defend cities already in ruins. By 1945, many Bf 109s weren't launched from airfields. They were pulled from barns, roads, even autobahns converted into makeshift runways. The final versions, like the K4 and H variants, were intended to be the ultimate high-altitude fighters. They had pressurized cockpits, advanced radar equipment, and new, more efficient engines. On paper, they could challenge the new Allied jets, but they were too little, too late. The factories building them were bombed out. The fuel they needed was gone. The aces who could master them were either dead or captured. The war had bled Germany dry. Still, the Bf 109 fought on, through rubble, fire, and smoke. Even as the world turned to jets, this piston-driven warhorse refused to fade. But let's not romanticize its ending. The Bf 109 didn't go down in glory. It went down in desperation. Hundreds of them were destroyed on the ground by Allied strafing runs. Others were abandoned. Some pilots defected or surrendered in mid-air, and others, young men barely old enough to shave, were told to fly into the heart of death to defend a nation already lost. In total, more than 1,700 German pilots died in training accidents with the Bf 109. Thousands more died because of its short range, its stubborn handling, or its demand for expert skill. This aircraft claimed more of its own than perhaps any fighter in history. And yet, it's still remembered as a legend. Not because it was perfect, but because it symbolized the brutal truth of war, that even the most advanced machine can't save you when the system behind it is broken. In the end, the Bf 109 was both sword and shroud, a deadly marvel that killed its masters.